In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the texture attributes that are tied to our fluid container. Now, I'm going to go through some of these attributes, some a little deeper than others, because some of them are pretty obvious as to what they do. Now, I've got lesson 14 opened up here, and if I pull back, you'll notice that I have two containers in here, and we're going to focus on this first container as we do a couple of these demos. Now, this container has no emitter. If I hit play, nothing comes out of it. It's pretty basic, just a container. What I want to do is go ahead and set this with a full constant set of color. That way we can evaluate what we're trying to do with our texture. So over in our contents method, I'm going to take my density and change that from dynamic grid to gradient. And that will choose this as a constant gradient, which essentially just fills up the container. Okay. If you wanted to, we can go ahead and set the fall off method, but we'll just leave it as is. All right, right now, if I go down to the textures attributes and I turn on texture color, I get what looks like nothing. Well, something is actually happening, I just can't see it. Well, the reason I can't see it is if I open up shading and take a look at my color, it's white. So there it is, it's white. Well, let's change that. So let's change our colors from something like white to a red. And for this to work, we need at least another color. So let's go ahead and add another color to our ramp, and then we'll choose a bright yellow. Okay, so instantly you can see how turning this texture on has added texture to our system. Now, what's nice about this is you can go ahead and use the texture of the incandescence and the opacity, and all those feed right in from the shading attributes right up here. All right, I'm going to focus just on color because the others work just the same. But what we're going to look at is this texture type. All right, you have 5 types that you can work with. Perlin noise is the basic, fastest. It's the regular noise node that you find in the Hypershade. Been in Maya forever. Billow is a different type. As you can tell, as soon as I chose that, you get a softer texture. You get a kind of a cloud-like. And what you can use this for is in 3D containers, use this to actually generate your clouds inside of your system. The coordinate method is fixed. Actually, let me finish the rest of these. Volume wave is great when you have a 3D container because it's going to be a wave that's going to move through 3D. Okay. Now again, if I hit rewind and play, these aren't animated. Okay. We can animate them, but by default they're not. We have wispy, which is essentially the Perlin noise, but then we're smearing it. So if we look at Perlin noise right here, and then we look at wispy, we've just got the same noise texture, but we're smearing it into our container. And then you have space-time, which is essentially the Perlin noise, but now you have the ability to connect it to time. Okay? So I'm going to stick with Perlin noise just to keep it really, really simple. Now, the coordinate method, I'm going to come back and talk about coordinate method because that's a really, really important attribute that I want to show you that we're going to use this other example for over here. All right, so let's talk about some of these attributes. Again, color texture gain, you have an incandescence and you have an opacity. If these are turned on, those become active. Now what these allow you to do, let's look at texture opacity, is take the ramp and really modify that ramp or shift it. Okay, so again, if I take my texture gain to 0, I have no texture. It's just using the color. If I take it back to 1 and back up, I can override that actual ramp that I've just created a minute ago. My threshold adjusts the overall brightness. My amplitude adjusts the spread of that ramp. Okay, we're just stretching out that ramp. Now, ratio is a really important attribute because it's controlling the amount that this is blurring. But this frequency ratio is what I really want you to draw your attention to. Because if you wanted to have nice big wisps, you're going to make this smaller. If you want a tight pattern, you're going to make this larger. Now you have 3 attributes down here that I hardly ever use. The depth max will allow you to override the quality setting. The system will actually figure out what it needs to do at default. So if it says, oh, this is the size of the container, I think it needs a 2. You can override this, but you know, the texture is going to be non-predictable. Okay, it's going to have to rethink how that is going to be calculated, and you're going to increase calculation time. So something to think about. You can invert the texture right here, but if you're going to invert it here, why not just go back to the shading tab and redo your texture? So depends on what you're trying to do. Essentially what we're saying here is the areas of the ramp that were yellow and the areas that are red, flip them. And that's what you get. Okay. You have the ability to add inflection. Inflection will allow you to add a modifier to the noise. And so again, you can tweak out the noise. The only thing with this is you have it on or you have it off, right? So you're going to have to choose, yeah, I want it on or I don't want it on. Okay. Inverting that out, you can do that as well. All right, down below, let's talk about these few items, and then we'll talk about these down here. Texture time, such an important attribute, because what this is going to allow you to do is introduce a level of time that is independent of the timeline. So here I'm scrubbing the timeline and nothing is happening. However, if I adjust this attribute, there we go. If I adjust this attribute, you notice that the texture is moving through this object or through this container, but it's totally independent of time. So what's nice about that is because it's independent of time, you can have this texture time keyframed and move however you want, or you can write an expression to move it along with the timeline. Okay? The frequency is going to allow you to control the size of that overall movement, okay, and the overall size of the noise pattern that you're using. And you also have the ability to scale. So if I scale this, let's say in 2 in Y, I get this nice stretched look. And if I wanted to send these flames upwards, all I would need to do is move this texture origin. So as I animate this going in a negative direction, you notice my texture is moving up. So again, a lot of great control. Notice if I hit play, no problem. Plays back super fast. Okay. Now, implode, let me just increase the frequency here a little bit so you can really see this. Implode is going to allow you to do some really cool effects. So I can do a negative implode, which does a bulge. You can kind of see that. Or I can do a positive implode, which actually does a pinch. So if I wanted to create rays, I can do a pinch like this and then animate my time. And I can create a really cool ray pattern. Now, I can adjust where this implosion happens. So right now it's at 0, 0, 0, which is the center of the container. But I can move it down. Okay, so if I wanted to have like a horizon implosion, I could do that. And I can also move that texture up as well as adjust the scale. So again, really, really cool stuff, fascinating stuff, all built right into this system. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set my implosion back to 0. And let's talk about a few of these other options. Now, if I change this to billow, okay, and changing that to billow, I'm going to adjust my frequency a little bit just so I can see those softness there. Like that. And then let's just move this along where we can actually see some texture here. A little bit easier to look at. You have these billow density, spottiness, and randomness attributes now activated. So I can adjust how dense those high end of the ramp is represented. Spottiness, okay, are they going to be full? Are they going to have holes? I can also adjust the randomness of the size that these billows are generating. And then I can adjust this from an even pattern to a lot of randomness. Okay. And then again, you have the fall off. So you have how do you want those pixels to be represented as far as the alpha goes. So here we have a bubble, which means the center is transparent. The edges are opaque. We can do fast, which is just a quick preview, smooth, and then linear is your default. Now the only other options here that I want to talk about before we look at the other example is if we change this to volume wave, the number of waves now becomes active. Okay, so again, if we adjust texture time, you notice how those waves behave like that. If I increase this number and adjust this, I have that many more waves actually going through the container. Okay, if I reduce this down, just makes them larger. Okay, So now that we've talked about these different types of noise patterns, let's take a look at our example file here. Now, in another lesson, I'm going to show you how to actually emit from objects, but let's take a look at this object here. Now, all I essentially have is this object which is emitting this noise texture into the container. Now, the block is already there, so let me rewind this and move my block out of the way. Okay, and hit rewind. So it's not that it's already there. If I set this to constant like we did earlier, there's my texture. Okay. So essentially what's happening is the texture is already there, but by me introducing this cube into this container, I'm now emitting the particles into this container, but they're taking on the texture that is already being projected in here. So that's cool, but what if I actually want the texture to move with my particles? Well, that's where this attribute at the very top here of the textures attributes comes into play. This coordinate method right now is fixed, which is essentially saying here's 0, here's 1, here's 0, and here's 1. Put the texture in this 0 to 1 space and call it a day. However, if I change this to grid, what it's now going to say is, okay, put the texture at that point, and then as the particle moves, move the texture with it. So let me rewind and play this back. And now we actually get much better behavior and more of what we were expecting. Okay. Now, you have an override of how this speed interacts. So if I reduce the speed, I'm going to get almost like what I just had. You can kind of make out the projection, okay, and then it kind of takes over and starts to swirl. Now, if I increase this, you see how fast it swirls together? If I set this to 1, essentially it's going to move directly with the particles. So as it's born, it's going to go and move and swirl and do its thing. Okay, so let me, just as an example here, let's turn off the positive y boundary. There we go. And you can see how if I adjust this coordinate speed, how it lingers. We can kind of see that. Let me reduce it way down. You can see right here is a good example. This area lingers behind, and then it slowly starts to move, but it's moving at 0.04 times the actual movement of the particles. However, if I increase this, you can see that they're getting picked up and moved along. And again, this is a great way to get some really, really neat looking particles without having to have a lot of time and energy put into how the fuel and how the temperature reacts when you can just do it with a texture.